Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I am so excited to be coming to you with another part in our series of video and podcast to help us really contextualize the content for our class and give us the leisure of time within our class sessions to really dig into questions, application, and interestingly enough, performance of the material for our class. Today, we're going to be talking about understanding performance at the individual and at the group level. We have a couple of objectives that we want to focus on today, really understanding and assessing performance, but doing this at three distinct levels: the individual level, the group and team level, and then the organizational level. This is something that really plagues the HRD and the HR and OD fields. We try to understand or we try to apply the idea of performance with our stakeholders or with our executive teams or our C-suite teams, and this can get to be a very tricky area. It becomes a very gray and ambiguous area. We're going to talk about that. And the last thing we're going to do today is really kind of talk about questions going into next week, talking about, ironically, performance, effectiveness, and productivity, but from the perspective of you as the student, what are the things that are kind of coming up? So let's move this idea forward. Let's take this picture here for a moment of a group of runners. And how would we assess performance here, right? Perhaps these individuals are professional runners. They're sponsored. This is actually how they go to work every day. They run. They're professional athletes. Well, what are all the ways that we could actually measure performance? What if we, instead of reporting who won the race and who came in last, which as a kind of personal note would probably be myself, right? What if we actually just took the mean or the average score of all of the runners who ran the race, and we counted up all of the times that everybody ran, and we divided it by the total number of times, which would give us the average time for the entire race? We could just report the race that way. Certainly that's a measure of performance, right? It is the aggregate of how fast or slow a group of people worked. The problem with this, though, is it doesn't tell us anything about individual performance. It doesn't tell us anything about the people who finished first or the people who maybe finished last or even in the middle. And if we want to know what is it that helps someone be the best, we cannot study the worst because, well, it doesn't tell us anything about what the people who ran the fastest did to train or get there, or what was their mental state, or what were their strategies, right? And the same thing about the folks that finished last. We have to understand their behavior at an individual level, but perhaps their strategies and what they did to prepare as well. We have to be very clear about how we define performance at work. This idea of effectiveness, here on our screen we have this idea of a manager effectiveness. Well, what does effectiveness actually mean? What are the measures of performance that really get to the idea of effectiveness? Someone could run into your office. This has maybe happened to a couple of you, and people will run into your office and they'll say, Brad, we need manager training. We've got to have some training around managers. And you say, well, what are you talking about? Well, our managers are just not effective. What does that mean? How do we define it? How do we define it at the individual, the group, and at the organizational level? That's what we're going to dive into today. So when we define performance, there is this inherent difficulty in defining and both measuring performance. There is ambiguousness, there's grayness, there's cloudiness about defining and measuring performance. In a nutshell, however, performance is behavior at work that has significance because of the outcome it leads to. Now, we can contextualize this idea of significance based on your own experience. So if you think about your own experience of work, what is it that has significance for you? What does your organization care about? What are the things that drive performance metrics at your work? In a nutshell, performance is that behavior at work that has significance because of the outcome it leads to. There are differing meanings given to performance, effectiveness, and productivity. All of these are oftentimes subjective measures. They're often subjective because they're based on someone else's interpretation. These things can be problematic. Well, what does subjectivity in the area of performance and effectiveness and productivity, what does this actually have to do with research? And we have to go back a couple of classes and remember our friend the fuzzy bear. Sometimes people will come into us and say, well, things are slow or not enough or too much or too high. We have to operationalize research questions, and that means being specific, not fuzzy. We have to say, well, what do you mean by not being effective? What do you mean by not performing high enough or well enough or slow enough or not enough or too high? We have to translate a generally abstract statement about a problem into something that is actually very applied, discrete, and concrete. Well, our managers are actually missing the mark by X, Y, and Z. We're actually 20% behind in production. We've fallen $1.5 million short of our budget because of overspending. We have to cut that someplace. We have to operationalize exactly what we mean. So we take something like an effectiveness or productivity, and we provide a real-world application to those questions. So this is kind of where we turn the corner, I think, on research and human resources, and really kind of here's where we begin to smash these things together, if you will. Oftentimes we talk about research and organizations, but what we're really talking about is defining, measuring, and understanding performance. Research is about contextualizing, defining, the measuring, and the understanding of what we mean by performance. Research is the application of definition here. It is the actual measuring. It is the actual understanding. Here is where we begin to turn our corner. Again, we go back to this idea of our runners. How we define it has implications. As I draw on the analogy we used earlier, if we use a group performance mentality, it tells us only about the average, which leaves out some information. If we look at only the people who finished first and we define that as performance, it leaves out some people. If we define it as the slowest or the middle, if we define it as a conglomeration of races, right? As an organization, we compile things from all kinds of different places. If we think about race number 1, race number 2, race number 3, race number 4, and we average those things together, how we define performance here has implications. It's important to be very clear about what we're actually defining. So defining performance is really understanding what are the behaviors that employers value. Now, I might ask you if we were in a class together, well, what are the examples of behaviors that organizations value about their employees? Well, perhaps it's being on time, perhaps it's being efficient, perhaps it's being accurate, perhaps it's about creativity and innovation, it's about engagement, it's about satisfaction. What are the behaviors that tell you that someone is engaged or someone is satisfied? What are the behaviors that tells you that someone's being creative or innovative? What exactly, if we were going to name the behavior, what is the behavior that we're talking about? And when you're talking with someone about performance, you need to speak of behaviors. What are the things that we actually value here? If we move this forward, we can think about effectiveness as the result of performance. Again, I might pose this question for you if we were in class together. What does effective mean in your organization? What does it mean to actually be effective? Is it about hitting the target here? Is it about trying out something? Is it about helping out a coworker or a teammate? What does it mean to be effective? If we move this idea forward, productivity is effectiveness compared to cost. So productivity, if we were to create kind of an equation here, effectiveness is divided by cost, which equals productivity. How do you know if you're actually being productive at work? What does it mean to actually be productive? Think about this in terms of performance and effectiveness, right? And how those two things, and really three things, are related here. What does it mean to be productive for you? What does production mean for you? And for each of us in class, every single one of us, production, productivity, effectiveness, and performance may mean something different, which is why it's very important to define it. So we have to translate performance to a measurable criterion or an outcome. And there are a couple of things that we want to talk about here. The first is objectivity. Is it measured the same regardless of person? Is performance an objective measure of production or effectiveness? Meaning, is it measured the same regardless of position, person, team, group, organizational structure? Is it reliable? Does our instrumentation measure the criterion consistently? So, is it actually a reliable measure of performance? Does it actually do it time and time and time and time again? The idea of validity, does our instrument measure what we say it does? If we say that if we take a stopwatch and we say this stopwatch measures time, is that a valid measure of time? Sure. If I was to say this stopwatch measures ounces of liquid, well, it measures something, but it's probably not ounces of liquid. It's probably not a valid measure of weight or ounce. It's probably not a valid measure of color. It's probably not a valid measure of a lot of things. We have to make sure that our instrumentation is not only reliable and objective, but also valid, that it actually measures what we say it does. This is a problem in organizational research. There's this fourth idea of discriminability here. Can our criterion distinguish between levels? Can we distinguish between the best and the middle ground and perhaps those people who are performing below? Can our criterion actually tell us that there are groupings of people? And then can we readily assess that data? So is it objective? Is it reliable? Is it valid? Does it have discriminability? And is it accessible? And our books talk really specifically about all 5 of these areas. So there's this idea of individual performance. Individual performance measures are things like absenteeism, sale level, widgets constructed, how many things we make a day, or articles published. These are very subjective measures. They're performance ratings, awards achieved, and attitude, right? There's a rating effect bias here. I would encourage you to take a look at our text page 128 to learn more about this. There's this idea of individual performance. Don't miss this. Individual performance, objective measures of that can be things that we know, right? Absenteeism, widgets constructed. And then there are subjective measures, which are things like performance ratings or attitude. We have to understand what are the objective and subjective measures of those areas, as well as what are the biases inherent in assessing someone's individual level of performance. There's the second level, which is group and team performance. The objective measures of group and team performance are things like end products or productivity or outcomes or financial measures. Subjective measures include things like trust, honesty, communication, decision-making, etc. There's an inherent bias in these. Well, how are these ratings actually determined? How is productivity or outcomes or end products or financial measures, how are they determined? How might you determine them? How would you know if someone's being financially productive? Or if they're trustworthy or honest, or that they've made good decisions. Our book talks about alpha, beta, and gamma. This is interesting and interesting points and considerations for group performance. Don't get so caught up in the idea of alpha, beta, and gamma. This not things that are often used in organizational performance per se. But I think it is important to know what are the objective, subjective measures there, and what are the biases and how are they determined. The last and third group is the idea of organizational performance. Things like turnover, sales, volume, profit, market share, and ROI would be things that are objective. Subjective measures are things like culture, reputation, work-life balance, engagement. Again, there's this inherent bias here in how are these ratings determined and who are they determined by. So the idea of engagement, well, who determines what's high and what's low? Who determines whether or not someone has a great place to work, a great culture, or what the work-life balance is here? How do we know what turnover level is bad or good? What level of turnover is acceptable or not acceptable? So again, there's this inherent sense of bias in how these ratings are determined and who they're determined by. All right, guys, as we begin to kind of wrap up our class tonight or today, whenever you might be watching this podcast, on performance in organizations, I want to connect that with performance in our class. So if you remember last week, our very first assignment came due, the theory assignment, and we'll be getting that back to you as quickly as we can. We're starting to go through that and grade that now and provide feedback and comments. And so you should be getting that back soon, probably within the week here. And remember that this week, the article critique number 1 is due. And then next week, article critique number 2 is due. So I don't want you to miss that. If you haven't yet taken a look at the syllabus, I would encourage you to do that. I know that this is a lot. It's a kind of a busy time of the semester, and part of these asynchronous classes and doing these podcasts is about giving you back some of that time. So hopefully you've been able to utilize that time and you found this to be helpful. I also want to mention the Writing Center, the University Writing Center. If you haven't had a chance to use that as a resource yet, I would encourage each of you to reach out to them in a way that's most appropriate. Remember, they have both a face-to-face version and an online component, and so if you're not local, you can still utilize that resource, which is kind of awesome to have that. For those of you who have used it, I hope you've had a really positive experience and that you can share that with your peers here in the class. One last thing I wanted to mention, October the 9th, we're actually going to be meeting again synchronously. So this is the last week that we're going to be having these podcasts. So October the 9th, we resume our synchronous classes again, which is kind of exciting because I miss you guys, and I can't wait to see you guys again and to hear about what you're learning and answer any questions you've got and really just kind of have some dialogue about this idea of research and research methods in organizations. Guys, until next time.